Welcome to the debate. Today, we're confronting what is really the defining paradox of enterprise technology in 2025. We're calling it the GenAI Divide. And on one side of this divide, the technical acceleration it's just undeniable. We're seeing models achieve what a lot of people are calling System 2 reasoning, the ability to plan, to iterate, and to process really complex instructions, not just, simple reflexive responses. The cost of raw intelligence is just plummeting. Yet on the other side, you have this brutal operational reality. Approximately 95% of organizations globally are reporting zero measurable return on investment, zero tangible ROI from their generative AI initiatives.
95%. It's a staggering number.
It is. So the central question we have to get into today is why, does this pervasive failure to realize value stem primarily from the inherent technical fragility of the models, meaning vendors are just fundamentally overselling brittle capabilities? Or is it a systemic failure of the enterprises themselves to adopt the rigor and the deep assurance frameworks needed to harness this new stochastic capability? My position on this is pretty firm. The required technical capabilities and the verification standards, they demonstrably exist now. We have mature frameworks like the EU AI Act. We have ISO 42006. The problem is a systemic organizational failure to implement the necessary governance and process change to capture the value that the technology is ready to deliver.
See, I come at it from a very different way. That 95% failure rate, it's not some coincidence, and it's not just a failure of, lazy procurement teams. It is a direct and, I think, inevitable consequence of vendor hype crashing into persistent technical fragility out in the wild. The operational reliability you need for high-stakes enterprise workflows, especially those that depend on complex RAG systems or multi-step agentic automation, it is simply unattainable for most buyers right now. My focus is on the fundamental system limitations that vendors are actively obscuring through some pretty sophisticated AI washing.
Okay, well, let's start right there then with the enterprise side of the equation. That data point, 95% with zero measurable ROI, is tied directly to why so many companies are stuck in what sources are defining as pilot purgatory.
Pilot purgatory is a great term for it. It just suggests inertia, doesn't it?
Exactly. They treat generative AI as a surface-level add-on, a simple chatbot or a co-pilot that they just layer over existing, and let's be honest, often broken internal processes. This isn't just poor technology selection. It's fundamentally a failure of what you'd call decision intelligence. They haven't redefined the problem they're trying to solve. They've just put a glossy AI skin on top of the existing dysfunction. And the reason this matters so much is because the tool itself is commoditizing at an incredible rate. We've seen the performance gap between the top proprietary closed models and the best open-weight models narrow to a negligible 1.7% by early 2025. That 1.7% gap isn't the core problem. Intelligence is no longer the scarce resource here. The 5% of organizations that we do see succeeding, the value extractors, they prove the model works when it's implemented correctly. They commit to deep integration. They structure their proprietary data specifically for AI consumption. And crucially, they undertake intense workflow re-engineering. They get the AI is a stochastic component, that it's based on probability and needs specific audit trails. So they align success not with these vague self-reported metrics like employee productivity, but with clear P&L impact. The failure isn't the hammer. It's the organization's inability to rebuild the foundation it's trying to strike.
That all assumes the enterprise has a fair shot at success, and I just don't believe they do when vendors are so actively engaged in this sophisticated deception, which I call AI washing. Look, we're seeing the widespread sale of the illusion of proprietary technology. You have companies selling these expensive wrappers that are, in reality, just thin layers on top of third-party APIs like OpenAI or Anthropic. So buyers are inheriting massive supply chain dependency risks, complex liability webs, unpredictable costs, all without their IT or their legal teams even knowing it. This level of technical opacity makes the rigorous integration you're demanding nearly impossible for the average company. And then look at the technical floor of AI for complex automation. This is where the reality bites hardest. We've seen enormous hype around agent systems. AI systems designed to perform multi-step tasks autonomously. But these things suffer from what we're calling the agent reality gap. In professional tasks, like a complex CRM workflow, these agents hit, maybe a 55% success rate? But when that workflow gets more complex, say a 6-step sequence with multiple tools and decisions, that success rate often drops precipitously. Sometimes down to a frankly unusable 25%. And the reason for this is that vendors are using the future tense trap. They're marketing capabilities that are exploratory, experimental, or literally still on their roadmap, the stuff they hope works in 6 months, as if they're robust and functional today. And this just forces buyers into these high-risk, non-deterministic production systems that simply cannot guarantee the reliability needed for enterprise operations.
I see why you think that, and I agree that agent fragility is a core challenge, but I would frame the debate differently. That fragility isn't some unknowable black box. It's a known engineering risk profile. And its persistence, to me, reveals an implementation failure on the part of the enterprise to demand transparency and verification. You noted that the primary failure mode for agents is failure in planning and state management, which leads to what experts call the hallucination of success, where the agent says it succeeded even though the transaction failed, or it just gets stuck in infinite loops. But this known technical fragility gives us the necessary countermeasures for the enterprise. Trustworthy procurement has to stop looking at irrelevant, generalized metrics. Why are companies still relying on general Q&A benchmarks like MMLU, massive multitask language understanding, when they're implementing an autonomous agent? It's utterly useless for evaluating workflow automation. The enterprise must instead demand specific, relevant performance metrics. We need task goal completion, or TGC, which just tracks if the job was finished successfully end to end. We need pass rate at K for multi-step workflows, which tells you how many attempts K it takes to succeed. If the enterprise fails to demand metrics on the agent's performance degradation, its drop in success rate, as the chain of thought goes past, say, 5 steps, that is an implementation failure, not a model failure.
That's a compelling point regarding the correct metrics, but you are assuming the enterprise has the leverage and, frankly, the expertise to enforce them. Let's go back to the opacity issue. How can a standard IT or procurement team truly verify if a vendor's agent has verifiable rollback mechanisms, the ability to undo a failed step, or if the vendor has just rebranded a complex, expensive if-then script and called it an autonomous agent? The very nature of non-determinism in true agents makes them difficult to audit even for experts. You're demanding that 95% of companies basically transform into forensic AI audit shops before they can even buy a tool. That just seems like an unrealistic baseline for success.
Well, it's not about becoming a forensic shop. It's about mandating the existence of a verifiable trust architecture, which, by the way, is now becoming a legal global requirement. The maturation of global regulatory environments means trust is finally transitioning from, a sentimental concept to a verifiable engineering state. Just look at the enforcement of the EU AI Act's GPII obligations coming this August. This sets a binding legal baseline for transparency. It requires providers to maintain detailed technical documentation and conduct adversarial testing. We also have the maturation of audit standards, specifically ISO IEC 42006. And this isn't just another standard. This one standardizes the auditors of AI management systems. So if an auditor is certified under 42006, they are verifying a repeatable, verifiable process. It transforms trust from a leap of faith into a standardized engineering process. The enterprise's duty is simple. Procurement has to mandate specific artifacts. They have to demand TechOps documentation aligned with Annex 4 of the AI Act. This is basically a detailed blueprint of how the system operates and its known limitations. They must require model cards detailing performance boundaries, and they must demand a risk management file mapped to the NIST AI RMF, which standardizes risk management across 4 functions: govern, map, measure, and manage. If the vendor can't provide these mandatory artifacts, they are immature and the enterprise has to walk away. That's a governance success that prevents a technical failure.
I wholeheartedly agree that legal compliance and frameworks are essential, but I just don't buy that regulatory checklists alone are sufficient to pierce the veil of sophisticated AI washing. Vendors are experts at exploiting conceptual loopholes to achieve higher valuations. One common tactic is what I call connected conflation. They take a simple rule-based IoT device, a basic software tool, and they label it intelligent, commanding AI-level multiples on price, even though the actual AI component is negligible or non-existent. They also exploit the AI-powered vague claim, just refusing to specify where the AI lives in the stack, which makes compliance and auditing checks impossible because you can't verify the inputs or outputs. To truly verify compliance, enterprises have to employ technical forensics, not just accept paper trails. Relying on a vendor's self-attestation against ISO 42006 is just not enough. You need active verification. For instance, you need latency analysis to fingerprint the model's infrastructure. If a vendor is claiming to sell you a custom proprietary foundation model, but it exhibits the exact same time-to-first token latency profile as, say, GPT-4o, that's a massive red flag that it's just a wrapper. You need adversarial prompting, designing inputs to trigger known safety refusals, which in turn can leak the underlying model's boilerplate, exposing the vendor's dependency. You need active network inspection to check for hidden calls to public APIs. The law is a great start, but forensic skepticism is the only real defense against intentional obfuscation.
But that level of skepticism is exactly what I mean by decision intelligence. I maintain that the failure lies in the enterprise's decision not to invest in the minimal internal competency needed to deploy that forensic skepticism. The 5% are doing it. Let's talk about one of the core technical limitations you cited, hallucinations. Vendors love to claim RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, and these massive long context windows have solved the issue. And we both know that is factually incorrect and frankly dangerous marketing.
It is dangerous. It gives a false sense of security. The lost in the middle phenomenon, for example. It persists even with massive context windows. The model just ignores key facts if they're buried in the middle of a long document. And worse, RAG introduces new, sophisticated failure modes that are very difficult for the end user to detect. You see retrieval poisoning, where irrelevant or malicious data chunks are retrieved, confusing the model and causing it to confidently assert falsehoods derived from bad source material. And then there's the even more insidious input conflicting hallucination, where the model's pre-trained knowledge just overrides the information it retrieved from the RAG context if they happen to disagree. We also have the inference economics challenge, the cost of trust. Models that engage in genuine System 2 reasoning impose a significant latency tax and an energy tax because they have to generate internal chains of thought before they answer. And vendors, faced with massive compute costs, might silently optimize for speed and cost savings, cutting corners on reasoning depth. This trade-off between speed and accuracy is inherent to the architecture and is nearly impossible for the typical buyer to audit without deep forensic tooling.
That's an absolutely critical point on the inherent trade-off. I would just frame the remedy differently. The enterprise has to mandate transparency regarding this cost of thinking. If a vendor is selling a reasoning model, procurement must require inference latency SLAs that explicitly distinguish between the standard, fast query and a deep reasoning query. If the system genuinely needs to think, that means requiring a 5 to 10 second pause before the first token appears. That pause is the technical signature of a thinking model. If the vendor can deliver instant answers every time, they are probably not performing the reasoning they promised. Furthermore, the enterprise has to audit the router logic, the internal system that decides which model or computational path to use. If that logic is tuned primarily for cost savings over reasoning accuracy, the buyer has to know that. And on hallucinations, enterprises must stop accepting vague promises like 99% accuracy. They have to demand quantifiable metrics specific to their own data domain. We need the micro-hallucination rate, or MIHR, the percentage of factually incorrect sentences produced, and the macro-hallucination rate, the number of overall responses that contain a hallucination. A vendor who claims zero hallucinations is either, mathematically illiterate or purposefully misleading buyers because it's a statistical impossibility for these models. The failure here lies with the enterprise for accepting a claim that is technically nonsensical rather than demanding a quantifiable citation accuracy metric that they can verify against their own knowledge base.
So we ultimately agree that active adversarial verification is mandatory, but the sophisticated ability of vendors to mask this fragility through proprietary wrappers, by exploiting the agent reality gap, by obfuscating that essential cost of thinking trade-off, it all means that the burden of proof placed on the average enterprise is just too high. That 95% failure rate isn't a lack of effort. It's a reflection of the fact that the technology remains functionally unreliable and non-deterministic for the complex, high-stakes workflows that actually generate multi-million-dollar ROI. Until that technical reliability floor rises, the enterprise has to assume fragility.
I still maintain that the paradox of high technical capability and low ROI is solvable, but primarily by a fundamental shift in enterprise mindset. Skepticism has to be engineered into the procurement process. The verification artifacts, from EU AI Act documentation to ISO-accredited audit processes, they exist to transform trust into a rigorous, auditable engineering reality. The 5% success stories prove that value extraction is indeed possible, but only when organizations invest in the internal decision intelligence competency required to audit the evidence, rather than just relying on vendor claims.
I think we have established that critical technical fragilities persist, especially in agent systems and hallucination rates. And these risks are consistently masked by vendor hype and the whole wrapper economy. Operational value is contingent upon demanding specific, hard technical proof. It means focusing on metrics like task goal completion and deploying adversarial testing to root out vulnerabilities like indirect prompt injection, the ability to inject hidden commands into the system.
I agree the challenge is complex, and it requires deep commitment. I think the central challenge is not whether AI can deliver value. It's whether organizations are prepared to match the technology's inherent complexity and probabilistic nature with an equal rigor in their own internal verification and operational transformation. Thank you for sharing these important perspectives on the GenAI Divide. This has been The Debate.